Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Okay there. Thank you, Jim. This is David Eastaugh. This is the C86 show. I've just been trucking through some archives of different people I've interviewed over the last few years. And this is one that I unearthed, and I thought, must archive this one. This is Barry Miles, author of numerous books, and was a bit of a mover and shaker on the 1960s London underground and culture, counterculture, and was the co-owner of the Indica Gallery, and also helped start the independent newspaper International Times. He was there at the 14-hour Technicolor Dream. It is worth archiving this. Actually, this interview came out when he just did a book, I do believe, on the 70s. Yes, it was, he says, looking down at his notes, the 70s. In the 70s, Adventures in the Counterculture. It was on Serpent's Tail, 2011. My God, this is a very old interview. Anyway, this is me, this is Barry. Enjoy. I did. Now, the reason for sort of the interview is because you've just got a book out called In the 70s, The Adventures in the Counterculture. But before that, your main thing has been the 60s, hasn't it? So for the listeners who have not come across you before, could you just give us a sort of an idea of where you've come from and your background?
Well, yes. I mean, it is actually a continuation of a book I originally did called In the 60s. And in the 60s, I was involved in the sort of underground countercultural scene. I was, first of all, involved with the Albert Hall poetry reading of 1965. Allen Ginsberg, the poet, was staying with me at the time. And so I was very closely involved with all of that, including the original idea. And after that, a friend of mine called John Hopkins and myself had the idea of starting an underground newspaper in Britain. And we started something called International Times, with, of course, the help of an enormous lot of other people. And International Times, or IT as it was known, carried on right through till about 1974, in fact. The first issue came out in October 66. The launch party for that was the first time that the Roundhouse was ever used as a music venue, or any kind of venue. Before that, it was a gin storage warehouse that Gilby's Gin had. And there we had the Pink Floyd and the Soft Machine and bands like that played, the first time ever to big groups.
And this was the 14-hour Technicolor Dream, wasn't it?
No, that was a bit later. That came about 8 months later. Oh,
right. So what was the launch party then?
It was just the first. It was a big gathering. It was the first time really there was any kind of underground scene in London. It was just to launch the International Times, and it was a death trap, really, to be quite honest. There's only the one very narrow staircase leading in. Had there been a fire, there were great big doors in the Roundhouse leading out into the goods yards of the British Rail. But
it would have been.
It was a nightmare, really. There was only 2 toilets for about 3,000 people, and of course it had a very, very poor electricity supply. And the Pink Floyd, at the height of their their big hit, they didn't have any records yet, but their biggest number, they blew all the power out, so it was quite dramatic. and then after that, or rather just before that, I'd started a bookshop and art gallery called Indica, which became famous really because that was where John Lennon met Yoko Ono, because we gave her first show in Europe.
Right, and that was when John was there and he saw the apple.
That's right. Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and he climbed down. There was what really made him like her was there was a stepladder in the middle of the room, and you had to climb up. And on the ceiling there was a sort of circular canvas with some writing on it, but very, very small. And hanging from it was a magnifying glass, and you had to peer at it in order to read it. And he thought it would be something rude, And of course, but it wasn't. It said yes, I think. Right. So he thought that was very positive.
And so basically the Indica bookshop, that was responsible for bringing in the kind of Beat generation to the English culture, I guess.
To popularising it, certainly. There obviously had been other events, earlier on. Ginsberg and Corso, for instance, came to Britain in 1958 first of all, but it's true. I mean, there hadn't been much contact at all with any of the beats until 65, really.
And when was the poetry one at the Royal Albert Hall? Was that in 65?
That was 65, yeah, the
Right.
summer of 65.
And
So
then,
it's all a bit before the sort of hippies and everything. I mean, in many ways, it's seen as the sort of, you know, the crucial sort of key event which created that scene, because it was the first time really that a lot of people had realised that there was a sort of constituency of students and writers and artists and dress designers and, you know, all right across the board, really. You know, it was because everyone had their own little scene. You know, the theatrical people hung around the Royal Court, and you know, the King's Road was filled with all the dress designers and so on. And there was no real contact between them. Whereas this was the first time everyone seemed to have come together in, you know, with the subject of mutual interest. Which is why Hoppy and I thought, well, what these people really need is a newspaper, or what we really need is a newspaper.
and that was the International Times.
That was International Times, yeah. And then shortly after that, you know, Oz started, and Friends, and a few other papers, but ours was out first.
So how did you see, you know, like you had the sort of the beatniks and then the sort of the merging of the hippies. So you were there at the time. How did that sort of develop?
Well, I mean, it's a sort of false idea to sort of label these things in decades, you know, the 60s and then the 70s. I mean, really, the scene I'm talking about sort of began in about 1964, I suppose, which was the first time people started to take LSD, and there was a big interest in poetry, and a lot of Americans started to come to Britain, largely attracted by the Beatles, actually. And then that sort of carried right on through, and the 70s were really the 60s only more so. I mean, the hair in the 70s was longer, you know, the clothes more outrageous, the drugs, far more people were taking drugs. The sex was even more bizarre, you know, et cetera, right through till it got into, you know, kind of a strange situation where the punks sort of put a full stop to it, really. But even the punks, you know, much of the philosophy of the punks was still rebellious and anti-establishment, and many of them really were just hippies with short hair, as far as I'm concerned. You know, somebody like Joe Strummer, for instance, cast the I Ching in order to decide whether to join the Clash or not. I mean, you can't get more hippie than that, you know. And that was very much his background as well, of course.
So going just slightly back to the 60s and the sort of like, yeah, I know you just said you can't cast it in particular decades, but obviously after Woodstock and Altamont, there must have been a feeling that things had gone wrong by then. Or did you feel like it was just continuing?
I thought it was more, I mean, well, you do feel it's a continuing. I mean, you know, just because the date changes doesn't really change people much. So certainly, you know, the latter part of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, it just runs straight on, you know. I think at the end of the 60s, the people were very tired. You know, it was just so many years with not enough sleep and taking too many drugs and, you know, just running around too much. And certainly bands like the Beatles, you know, that was partly the reason for their collapse. You know, they'd sort of run their full course. And you had the similar kind of exhaustion, you know, right across the scene in many ways. And which is why new people like Bowie came up. But, you know, I mean, somebody like David Bowie had his beginnings at the Arts Lab, you know, and he was a mime artist and all the rest of it. I mean, he was very much out of a 60s hippie background.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he was at the first ever Glastonbury with an acoustic guitar and long hair.
That's it, yeah.
So it took him a little bit of time to sort of get into that sort of more Andy Warhol, I suppose, glam and punk, really, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was the next stage, you know, that whole group of people, you know, brought forward. I mean, Bowie was really big in America. I mean, he sort of led a lot of things forward. Somebody like, you know, Warhol, I absolutely adored him.
Yeah. So how did you feel? Because obviously you had your finger on the cultural zeitgeist during the 60s, and you were there sort of.
Oh, yes.
And then the 70s came along, and did you, as a sort of on a personal level, did you find it difficult to sort of keep the enthusiasm going, you know, while there was a younger generation came along, and there was like obviously the LA sort of soft pop cocaine scene? Did you feel that it was difficult sometimes to fit into the new scene that was developing?
Not really, because I sort of carried on sort of following what my contemporaries were doing in many ways. I mean, although my book is very much a personal memoir, it definitely follows the sort of trajectory that you know, this particular generation were doing. I mean, by the end of the 60s and the early 70s, people were moving off to live in communes in North Wales and Cornwall and places, and I did the same, except I did mine in upstate New York, and then went to live in a hippie commune in Berkeley with Allen Ginsberg and my girlfriend. We had a floor there. And, you know, so all the things that were happening, both, you know, right across the board, really, for that generation seemed to happen to me as well. So I didn't find any real conflict there. I mean, it was only really, I suppose, when the punks started to come out with this anti-hippie thing, which later on, I mean, a number of them have told me, like Mick Jones from The Clash, that was just something that Malcolm McLaren had told them all to do, because Malcolm and Bernie, the managers of the Clash and the Sex Pistols, were both very anti-hippie. That seemed to become the political position they all took. But in fact, most of them grew up, with that whole background, and as Mick Jones once told me, he said, of course we read the International Times and Oz and everything. That was our whole thing, but we were just, we had to say we hated hippies because that was what was going on at the time. But now, they've recounted all of that.
Oh yeah, I mean, they probably admit that they like, the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac as well.
Oh, very much. Well, certainly the Clash. I mean,
And did you go and experience any of the sort of the LSD trips that was taking place in America at the time?
I went up to visit Tim Leary in Millbrook, in upstate New York, and I also saw him over in Berkeley at the end of the 60s. So yeah, I was a bit involved with that scene, but I was never really that keen on it, really. To me,
you didn't go and see Ken Kesey at all, and
no, I never did. I mean, I thought his thing was kind of brutal, really. I mean, the spiking everybody of acid, and it was all. It may have been all very democratic, the idea that everybody should be able to have all this stuff, as opposed to, the sort of Leary East Coast sort of much more academic approach, I suppose, or a spiritual approach where people had to take it in special conditions and all the rest of it. Whereas Kesey, it was just some kind of blast, And the Merry Pranksters, again, they would just have these huge dances where all the orange juice was spiked. And so you'd have thousands of people on trips, and a lot of them on very bad trips. And I just didn't like the sound of it.
You must have seen a lot of damaged people during that time then, if that many...
Well, I don't know. See, I live very close to Soho. There's a lot more people, who are messed up on alcohol than I ever saw on acid. It's true. I mean, it can be dangerous. There's no question about that. I mean, there were some acid casualties.
But you must have seen people like Syd Barrett go from being sort of quite creative and quite together to being a complete disaster.
Yeah, I don't know whether that was acid, though. I think, he had a tendency towards schizophrenia anyway. And in fact, recent studies have shown that stroboscopic light actually affects insipid schizophrenia and can bring about episodes, and it's quite likely that it was his own light show that was causing a lot of the problems, which nobody realized it. Because it was so strange, he'd be perfectly okay, well, spaced out, maybe a bit high, but and you'd be talking to him, and then he'd go on stage, and within about a quarter of an hour, he'd be like, drooling and detuning his guitar strings and stuff, and it was just astonishing, the change that would come over him. So I don't know. I mean, that's not something that's been fully investigated yet, but there's been a number of, as it were, learned papers about it.
Yes. Well, Barry, thanks for talking to me. I think we've got enough there, and it's really a pleasure because I've got various books of yours, like the Hippies one and the one on this sort of. Well, I've really enjoyed all your 60s books actually. So
great!
It's been great talking to you, and thank you ever so much for the time.
Well, my pleasure.
Okay. Then.